count.
3, 2, 1.
Started.
Artificial clouds are clouds that are made by humans. Humans make clouds inadvertently and on purpose. This movie explains exactly how we make clouds and how humans are changing the climate through the use of aircraft. We'll also examine the reasons for making clouds deliberately, and they might not be what you think. This is the true story of artificial clouds. With all the conflicting information in the news media, it's difficult to know what to believe about climate change. And with groups trying to protect their interests and profit from government policies, it's hard to believe what anyone says. We've known all along that Earth's climate changes periodically and that ice ages come and go, so climate change may be perfectly natural. But you're about to see clearly why this cycle in Earth's history is different, a cycle which is completely new to this planet. The atmosphere is different today compared to last century, for a very specific reason, and it isn't the buildup of CO2. But as a scientist, you would have a very difficult time understanding this problem based solely on the chemistry and physics without first knowing the other matters of fact which might drastically affect your approach and your experiments, namely the Vonnegut connection, which we'll explain in a moment. What we're examining in this movie is probably the most important chemical affecting our atmosphere and climate today, but it's not usually mentioned in climate change discussions which revolve around CO2. Yet our top scientists at NASA tell us that clouds affect the climate more than CO2. And that's because, to a great degree, Earth's atmosphere regulates our planet's temperature between the energy radiated from the sun and the coldness of space. Earth's atmosphere is also the environment in which the natural cloud formation processes occur. Rain clouds are the basis of this natural hydrological cycle, which transports water from one place to another around the Earth. Now, let's get back to the artificial clouds. You already know the contrail science part. Commercial jets are larger than ever, and they travel higher, faster, and more frequently than ever before. As they fly, the combustion of hydrocarbons produces H2O. Over a gallon of water is created for every gallon of fuel burned.
Because to burn something, you're going to have to add oxygen. That's what it's all about. So, burns to produce, and it always produces these two major things that you have to account for. Carbon dioxide, gas, and water vapor. H2O gas. Well, there you go. That's it. Anytime you burn hydrocarbon, it's plus O2 makes CO2 plus H2O.
The water particles in the jet exhaust are blasted through the exhaust manifold into the sub-zero temperatures of the stratosphere at about 500 miles per hour, forming a thick wake of tiny ice crystals. Stratospheric jet clouds are much higher than tropospheric rain clouds, and because their moisture is in the form of ice, their texture is not wet but dry and powdery like fine snow. Stratospheric clouds made by jets have an immediate effect on the weather we experience, creating large shadows from high above. Can you spot the jet condensation trail in this photo? It's a trick question. All these clouds are jet contrails. But how is this possible? How can jets cover the entire sky with clouds? The answer starts, of course, with the understanding that for clouds to form, enough cloud condensation nuclei must be present. Contrails provide some of the necessary cloud nuclei in the form of ice particles and other aerosolized particulates. But the many chemical aerosols in this highly toxic exhaust still don't provide a sufficient explanation for the massive plumes they create, which persist and continue to gather mass and form clouds. So what is this mysterious chemical that causes drastic climate change by covering the Earth with artificial clouds? It's called silver iodide, which is a combination of silver nitrate and potassium iodide. And you're about to see why this chemical is responsible for the huge icy clouds that are routinely created by jets. For a complete understanding, let's look at the problem of artificial clouds in the context of the little-known history of weather modification and the Vonnegut connection. It began in the 1960s when Dr. Bernard Vonnegut, brother of author Kurt Vonnegut, made a dramatic improvement in cloud seeding technology. Dr. Vonnegut noticed that water vapor condenses rapidly around silver iodide particles. Silver iodide particles are perfectly crystalline in their configuration. This perfect crystal shape makes silver iodide the most hygroscopic material known, meaning water particles readily and instantly bond with the tiny crystals. You may never have given much thought to cloud seeding, but humans have been doing it regularly for over half a century, and today we're pretty good at it. In the US, most states have weather modification budgets, especially the arid western states like California, which has dozens of cloud seeding programs at the county level. And if you're studying the climate, you should be aware that more than 50 countries have budgets for weather modification now. These programs use cloud seeding aircraft that are commissioned specifically to increase rainfall and snowfall using silver iodide and salt chemicals. There are also other reasons for weather modification, including dispersing dangerous hailstorms or fog. But precipitation enhancement is the primary reason for weather modification in the 21st century. That is, artificial clouds are most often the result of attempting to make rain and to increase the mountain snowpack that keeps rivers flowing in the summer. While still referred to almost euphemistically as cloud seeding, the technologies and capabilities of the weather modification industry have evolved over its 70-year history. Today, we don't just sprinkle chemicals onto clouds, we make clouds. Local governments use weather modification companies like these to bring more rain and snow. In the US, the programs are administered by the energy companies and paid for by the consumers through a public purpose program surcharge on their utility bills. In other words, you are paying for these contrails perhaps more directly than you realized. But how do artificial clouds make it rain, and why? Let's look briefly at another important historical fact that's missing from climate change discussions: where our concerns about human interference with the atmosphere and climate actually came from. After Dr. Vonnegut's invention of silver iodide cloud seeding began to proliferate around the globe, these improved weather modification techniques quickly began to have a profound effect on the atmosphere. This did not go unnoticed by the U.S. Department of Transportation, which reported to the Secretary of Commerce that air traffic was beginning to affect the weather by inadvertently making clouds. In a 1974 report to the President and Congress, the Secretary of Commerce wrote, "The problems posed by climate variation are of worldwide concern." A study called GARP was initiated. In this experiment, approximately 40 ocean vessels, 13 aircraft, geostationary and polar orbiting satellite systems, buoy arrays, and special land stations from 70 nations engaged in the largest combined study of the atmosphere ever. Following the GARP study, in 1978, the U.S. Congress declared that weather and climate change affect food production, energy use, water resources, and other factors vital to national security. So we can see that this concern is not new. For over 40 years, world governments have been increasingly alarmed by the very noticeable changes in our atmosphere. But the growing fleet of cloud seeding aircraft continue to deploy more and more flights, spraying cloud-making material across the sky. Now we can see the two powerful forces at work creating artificial clouds: the spraying of tons of silver iodide into the upper atmosphere by small aircraft, and the cloud-making effect of large jets passing through the invisible silver mist. Small cloud seeding aircraft such as bombardier jets and high-altitude propeller planes deliver their payloads using silver iodide flares that are ignited by remote control. The flares are typically fixed to the wings of the aircraft and release the silver and salt mixture high into the stratosphere so it slowly drifts down into the moist air below. When the pilots of the cloud seeding aircraft can see ice forming on the wings, They know liquid water is present in the air and there's the potential to create storm clouds. So how many sorties do cloud seeding aircraft fly in order to make it rain or snow? The answer is as many as possible. The more aerosols, the more chance of condensation that makes thick rain clouds. Commercial air traffic helps to facilitate the rain by plowing through the field of silver mist, emitting the superheated steam that freezes into expanding clouds. Shade from the artificial clouds drops the temperature below, decreasing the air pressure and creating a low channel that flows like a river, drawing in the moist air. This can allow some ocean storms to make landfall that might otherwise be repelled by higher onshore pressures. Eventually, say the weather modification experts, the silver iodide disperses over such a wide area that it presumably has no noticeable ongoing effects on the environment. But we've now flown millions of silver iodide sorties in these ongoing aerosol operations, and unfortunately, our deliberate and inadvertent modification of the atmosphere can also inhibit natural rain cloud formation in more than one way, and that turns out to be a big problem. There's a limit to how much water can be extracted from the sky by enhancing and creating rain clouds. With no rules about who owns the sky rivers, when California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado use cloud seeding to extract all the moisture from the air, what happens to Texas? In 2011 alone, the state of Texas lost approximately 500 million bees and 10% of its forest land due to drought, despite intense cloud seeding activity.
South of San Antonio, we had aircraft flying on a dozen days in the month of July. Seeding involves the release of a material that includes silver iodide, and we've been doing that for about 10 years now.
In 2012, we confirmed that the most arid parts of the Earth, where ocean surface salinity is the highest, are getting even drier. Scientists also confirmed in 2012 that ocean salt levels in many areas have increased far more than expected. This is significant because most evaporation on the planet comes from the ocean, and the greater the surface salinity, the less efficiently water evaporates into the atmosphere. Since cloud seeding activities around the entire Earth use silver and salt-based chemicals, the very technique we use to make rain might also help to prevent rain. With a telescope, from the ground you can sometimes see the flares burning on the wings of the cloud seeding aircraft. Since these planes are at cruising altitude and have relatively small engines, they make only a small contrail wake that quickly disappears behind them. Now, enter the second force, the huge commercial airliners which carry billions of passengers each year flying directly through the silver mist. Unlike the small cloud seeding aircraft that precede them, these jets have huge engines that are many times more powerful, delivering over 250,000 pounds of thrust and creating enormous amounts of frozen steam as they climb to cruising altitude. At 25 to 40,000 feet, artificial clouds spawned by aircraft don't appear to move like rain clouds. They seem to be stuck in the sky. But using stop-motion photography, we can see hours of cloud movement in just a few seconds. Now we can see what happens when the big jets fly through the silver mist laid down by flight after flight of the cloud seeding aircraft. As the tracks continue, they merge and lose their contrail shape and begin resembling natural clouds. If you haven't noticed this before, it's just because you're not paying attention. It's not really your job to watch the sky. Most people don't, and few people are aware that in some parts of the world, including the western United States, artificially created clouds are far more common than naturally formed clouds. If we could see artificial clouds from jets move this way in real time, we might recognize them for the toxic swirls of gases and particulates that they are. We might notice the profound effect jet clouds have on the weather we experience when they move in front of the sun, creating shade. We might also wonder about the health effects of these toxic clouds and whether they might be related to the increasing lung cancer rates we're seeing. We might wonder too about the effects on the smaller creatures, the bees, the birds, and the butterflies. Weather modification companies, who obtain more and larger contracts every year, say that silver iodide cloud seeding is harmless. After all, silver iodide is inert, and spraying it in the air is like peeing in the ocean. It has no known adverse effect on the environment. However, this analogy is not accurate. Thousands of weather modification aircraft spraying tons of cloud-making chemicals into the air around the world is not so much like a person peeing in the ocean. It's a lot more like hundreds of people peeing in the swimming pool. Earth's atmosphere is a relatively very thin halo of gases that surround the planet, held in place by gravity, and silver iodide has been building up in our soil and water for over 70 years. Today, understanding clouds and their impact on the climate is one of NASA's primary missions. This specific area of study is called cloud-aerosol interaction, and NASA has launched satellites like CloudSat and Calypso with special equipment to study the atmosphere. The UN Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques bans weather warfare. However, it's not illegal to modify the weather for other reasons. No law prevents the government from making clouds in order to bring rain. In fact, it's their job. But silver iodide is an inorganic, non-soluble, hazardous chemical, and it's been shown to be highly toxic to fish, livestock, and humans. Numerous medical articles demonstrate that humans absorb silver iodide through the skin, lungs, nose, and GI tract. Even mild toxicity can cause serious health problems, and the incendiary material in the cloud seeding flares also contains aluminum, strontium, magnesium, and other toxic chemicals. So why do all these countries and local governments spend billions of dollars on silver iodide to make rain? Let's look at why our governments have allowed such aggressive development of weather modification programs. U.S. government document S-2191, a bill introduced into the Senate in 2007, echoes the same concerns Congress acknowledged in the 1970s, stating that the consequences of global climate change could pose a danger to the security interest and economic interest of the United States. And Congress finds that global climate change represents a potentially significant threat multiplier for instability around the world. In 2012, a UN report warned the world is running out of time to make sure there is enough food, water, and energy to meet the needs of a rapidly growing population. In less than 20 years, the world will need at least 50% more food, 45% more energy, and 30% more water, according to UN estimates. But our water supply is diminishing while our population continues to increase. If the United States had a major crop failure because of drought, food prices could rise so high so quickly that our economy could face utter collapse, and the many other countries dependent on the U.S. economy could follow. Underground aquifers in arid states like California are being depleted at an alarming rate, the consequence of our growing population and water needs. What happens if California, America's breadbasket, can't keep up its food production due to lack of water? But what we find on closer examination is that the solution we're becoming more and more dependent upon, cloud seeding to make rain, is one of the major causes, if not the main cause, of this problem. And we find that the real dangers of global warming are the global drying effects resulting from our interference with the natural atmospheric processes and the inhalation and ingestion of chemicals that now permeate every aspect of our environment. Let's recap what we've just seen. First and foremost, we're poisoning ourselves relentlessly through massive amounts of toxic silver iodide cloud seeding. We're worsening the long-term climate outlook by deliberately and continuously interfering with Earth's natural hydrological cycles. We're injecting water into the stratosphere, and water vapor is a greenhouse gas that traps more heat than CO2. The artificial clouds that block the sun in the daytime can prevent the heat from escaping at night, contributing to the overall warming effect. By filling the air with these chemical mists, we may also be interfering with the respiratory and photosynthetic processes of the plants, which could affect forests and food crops worldwide.
The tree death in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California has doubled since 1983. Stress and dieback have occurred from Alaska to Mexico. Since 1997, more than 20 million hectares or 50 million acres have been affected.
Rosalind Peterson is an agriculture expert who also believes that creating artificial clouds might do much more harm than good.
The United States had been engaged in upper atmospheric experiments since the 1960s. A lot of government agencies want to blame tree decline on climate change. without realizing that we're initiating weather modification programs across the United States. And the climate change we talk about, in other words, well, we're warming, well, yes, but if we get rid of these man-made clouds from the jets, we're going to cool down because a clear sky allows the heat to radiate away from the Earth.
Clouds trap heat, and if it's too warm at night, crops like apples, which require freezing nights in the winter, will fail. Other crops like avocados can be ruined if it freezes after the flower buds are formed. Still others, like strawberries, are ruined by rainfall at the wrong time. Some people in the scientific community have asserted that the sunscreening effect of artificial clouds would reduce skin cancer rates, and that alone would cost justify deploying solar radiation management projects in addition to the current precipitation enhancement programs.
CO2 stays in the atmosphere indefinitely. This means actually if we stopped all global emissions today, we'd still be screwed. Given the fact that we actually have never reduced emissions worldwide ever, this is a substantial challenge.
One technique that we do know works for sure is putting aerosols in the stratosphere. We know that we could put enough aerosol to more than offset doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere. 200 Bombardier jets have been calculated, for example. 200 Bombardier jets flying 24/7 could cool the atmosphere and offset a doubling of CO2.
Yet those who recommend SRM neglect to mention that this kind of sunscreen is made of particulates that are absorbed through your skin and into your body. And there are far worse problems for breathing. In America, we burn over 30 billion gallons of jet fuel each year. That means we're injecting over 40 billion gallons of water into the stratosphere every year in the United States alone, and each gallon of water creates thousands of gallons of superheated water vapor to mix with the silver iodide. Knowing that water is a greenhouse gas we're spraying right into the ozone, we've raised the question about the effect of this water we're injecting constantly into the stratosphere and the resulting crystalline sheet of ice and silver particles around the globe. The prospect of drought and crop failure that can result in economic collapse and starvation is a valid reason for governments to consider deploying precipitation enhancement programs. But the problems caused by the solutions we're using today should make us pause. The inhalation and ingestion of chemicals that permeate every aspect of our environment might make us want to reconsider adding more chemicals and greenhouse vapors into the air on purpose. The visual evidence alone is enough to tell us that artificial clouds and their toxic sources present an imminent danger to humans and all living things on Earth. This beautiful greenbelt running through some of California's driest land is made possible by the California Aqueduct. The aqueduct carries water from the Sierra Nevada mountains to the desert farmlands, enabling them to grow crops that would never be possible with water produced from cloud seeding. Humans have used irrigation to redistribute water for thousands of years, and we're better than ever at building things like canals. In America, with the western states quickly drying out and water supplies diminishing, we may need to create another aqueduct like this, a much bigger one that brings water from the plentiful sources of the north throughout the arid western states and into the Midwest. A $1 trillion project like this would not only stimulate the entire economy and provide millions of jobs, it would ensure the future of food crops without dependence on the toxic and vastly inadequate cloud seeding efforts that will never solve our drought problems. So what can we do to stop these misdirected and damaging cloud seeding programs that appear to be the cause of global warming and climate change? Stopping these toxic programs will ultimately be a matter of law. The sellers of DDT and malathion and lead and asbestos products told us those were safe too. But when we found out they were poisoning us, we got together and we stopped it. And it's only a matter of time before we also stop poisoning our water and land with toxic chemicals from cloud seeding. In time, everyone will know the truth. You and I are each one drop of water in a wave, and together we can spread the word, and we can gather mass and momentum, and we can quickly undo a lot of the climate change we're causing. We can change the climate back. If we do nothing to stop weather modification, at least we don't need to wonder anymore where the chemtrails came from, where our lung cancer came from, why birds and bees and trees are dying, why our children are born with problems they don't deserve. If we do nothing, we give our permission, and it'll continue, and we'll wind up where we're headed now. But in a way, artificial clouds are perfectly natural. It's just us humans interacting with our environment. And this story, the history of today, is our story.